All right. Hello. Good morning. My name is Benedetta Berti. I am lecturer at Tel Aviv University, and I work at the Institute for National Security Studies, INSS, which has been mentioned already a few times in the context that even INSS is able to join this project. So here we are. So I was facilitating the security discussion within INSS. We had a few different people participating. I would mention a couple of them just that you get an idea. One of them is Brigadier General Udi Deco, who has served in various senior posts in the IDF and most recently as the head of negotiation team in the Annapolis process. We also had Dr. Kobi Mikhael, who used to be the head of the Palestinian desk at the Ministry for Strategic Affairs. I'm mentioning this so that we get beyond the idea that talking about security and talking about how to accommodate the vision of security in a two-state-in-one-space vision is inherently impossible or utopian. We try to get into the nitty-gritty details of how this could work. I think that's important for a few reasons. Number one, we all agreed in our conversation that there cannot be a stable arrangement, there cannot be a mutually secure and sustainable peace without also a solid security arrangement. We also agree that often security is mentioned by one side or the other as one of these stumbling blocks. So we cannot move forward because we cannot agree on security and because our security needs are inherently irreconcilable. So I think that's a paradigm and that's an assumption that needs to be changed, and that's something that we try to do in the project. Sort of moving beyond the idea that security needs of both parties cannot be met, and moving beyond the idea of a zero-sum game vision of security versus a more integrative notion of security in which you have two states in one space that cooperate on a number of security issues and would pretty much view that common space as a common security area to protect. So the exercise we did is sort of see how would this work in a post-conflict environment. So we started from the assumption that there is a peace treaty that establishes clear internationally recognized borders, two sovereign autonomous states, Palestine and Israel, with a shared capital, that being Jerusalem. And we've started from a series of principles. One of them is both sides need to have an equality of rights, which doesn't necessarily translate in an equality of roles or responsibilities, because there is a clear problem in approaching this, and it is the asymmetry in capabilities that we have. So one of the long-term goals would be to bridge that gap in capabilities so that there could be equality in roles. But that was one of the main objections that the group raised. Let me specify, I'm the facilitator of the group, so I'm giving you what the discussion was. With that in mind, we started with the notion that because of that gap in capabilities, because of that asymmetry, the arrangement needs to be mutually agreed, obviously, needs to be incremental, and needs to be based on periodical performance-based evaluation by the mutually agreed third party. We thought, for example, an ad hoc security committee established by the quartet, or a party that both sides would agree to, that would every 5 years review security arrangements and make recommendations so that's as to bridge the existing gaps and move forward. So that was the framework. A mutually agreed, gradual, incremental, performance-based review security arrangement. Now, I have still quite a bit of time, so I'm going to go through 4 main issues and kind of give you a little bit of what are the details, just to see that this could actually work out. And we worked on several different topics, but I'm going to focus on those who are probably the most relevant: border security, freedom of movement, how does it affect the security situation, Jerusalem, mutual security agreements, and crisis prevention and crisis resolution, which are all very important things if you want to have a stable system. So we started with the borders, and we kind of talked about the existence of 2 parallel set of borders. We talked about the internal border within Israel and Palestine being what we call the soft border, so a border where a freedom of movement of goods and people is easing. You can think about it as initially a pre-Schengen Europe, and eventually the target goal will be a post-Schengen Europe. Secondly, in order to have that freedom of movement in the internal border, we thought about the external border as being a hard one, being a border that is much more strictly patrolled. And we started dividing the areas, who's doing the patrolling, who's patrolling what. I'm not going to get into the details now, happy to do it in the Q&A, but the notion would be eventually to have a 50-50 responsibility. Gradually, initially, the Palestinian Security Service would be assisted by international forces, which is something that had been agreed in the past, so we worked on that basis. In terms of the visas and in terms of the freedom of movement, we thought that one of the main important things to do would be to move from a system based on occupation, which is the current system, to one based on a relationship between two autonomous and sovereign governments. So the process of allocating visa would be done by civilian governments. The reason to revoke or deny a visa could be based on security and security assessments, but those security assessments need to be conducted on an individual profiling basis, thus eliminating group or racial profiling systems, which would be, I think, a significant improvement. So that's the opinion of the facilitator. So we worked on that, and we work on that as a practical steps towards moving towards greater freedom of movement, but again in a phased solution, in which the first step would of course be creating a more civilian-based allocation of visas, work, and residency permits. In terms of securing Israelis living in Palestine as Palestinian residents and Israeli citizens, I think we all agree that that would have to be a responsibility of the Palestinian security sector, meaning as an important step in creating this security space, there would have to be a revision of the status quo, so you wouldn't have to have idea of presence in the Palestinian territory. That would have to be part of the responsibility of the Palestinian security sector, which would have to undergo additional security sector reform and improvement, of course, to be able to tackle that role to the best of its ability. Jerusalem, a couple of words. If JAMA would have submitted their proposal to us, we would have actually given a security assessment of that. But instead, we had a different one, which was Jerusalem as a shared capital with a Palestinian and an Israeli municipality. And we worked with that assumption. In that assumption, we thought the Holy Basin area is being administered by an ad hoc Holy Basin police, which would be initially staffed by an international force with an Israeli and a Palestinian liaison office, and which would be responsible for allowing freedom of movement and guaranteeing the security in the Holy Basin area. We also got into what happens if a Palestinian citizen resident of Israel commits a crime in the Holy Basin area, and all those sort of scenarios, and we have a template of solutions which we can get into Q&A. But the idea is that it could work from a security perspective, which is the point I'm stressing over and over. Then we went into security guarantees, and pretty much we're seeing these two sovereign states with a defense treaty with a mutual defense clause, which would be very important. Mutual defense clause means if there is an external threat to the security of one state, that threat has to be considered as a common threat, which is something that puts external security as a common shared challenge, which is something that would help if, for example, we follow the template of negotiations so far, which foresees the Palestinian state as being demilitarized. So, of course, a consequence of a demilitarized state is that you need to have the external security provided externally. So the mutual security defense clause would deal with that. Then we thought about the creation of special Israeli and Palestinian security cooperation offices, which would have permanent joint committee dealing with border security, law enforcement, radicalization prevention, dealing with spoilers, as well as a permanent crisis operation room that would become active in the event of a violation of the treaty or in the event of any kind of act of political violence, as well as a crisis prevention permanent joint committee. So kind of we thought about how would this work out, and then we factor in initially. Excuse me, translator. I got a lot to cover and 30 seconds to go, so I'm trying to fit it in. I can have an extra minute, and then I will say the last thing, which is we also manage the role of an international force as a gradual process. So initially very involved. As time goes by and the security gap diminishes, that external security role would also diminish. And finally, we spend a lot of time, and I cannot get into it because of the 10 minutes, but one of the main discussions we had was about crisis prevention and response to crisis, because we felt that in the past, oftentimes when crisis strikes and an act of political violence occurs, both sides are unprepared to deal with it and then resume the process. So we thought that having very strict clauses as to what happens if things don't go according to plan could help. So for example, we thought about the creation of this permanent crisis operation room. We had a special committee to deal with violations. We have part of the international force dedicated to monitoring, verification, and compliance. And we have temporary built-in suspensions of some of the relaxations in freedom of movement pending a crisis, which means that as opposed to having the border closed indefinitely, it would be by agreement closed for 48 hours, which would allow us to then get back on track. So we basically, to close, we thought of all these little details. It's not easy. Security is one of the hard ones to really move forward for a number of reasons. One is the huge gap in trust. The other one is the huge gap in capabilities. The idea and the hope is as both these gaps close, so will the security implementation of the security arrangement become easier. But I think it was worth the effort. So that's what I have to report.